Signore e signori, buonasera. Buonasera, benvenuti, welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò, for a very special evening, and for an institution like ours that has about 120 events a year, saying that it's special and it's a first, but it is a first because it's the first time we present a podcast. We've never done anything of this sort, and we were speaking with David before that he's also exciting because it doesn't happen often to have this kind of format with real people in a real room and having a real room, because there are virtual rooms in which you can talk, and he will be able to talk about his great project. I have to say that I'm just giving you a welcome and saying a couple of things. I'm very biased because I listened to the podcast, I binged on it, and I couldn't stop it, and I loved it. So I'm not going to be very objective. I'm also a big fan of David's grandfather, il nonno, Franco Modigliani, that, as he says, when he goes to Italy, he realizes that his grandfather, Nobel Prize for Economy, but he had almost the status of a rock star when he was in Italy. And you can imagine about 30, maybe 28, 27 years ago, I was at the door here at the Casa, and there was an event, and I forgot the event, and I see Franco Modigliani coming up. And so I greeted him at the door, and he was charming and lovely and funny as he could be. So I have that memory very clear in my mind. There is also a picture that I was not able to find, but it's somewhere, and I'll bring it up. But I love the podcast, and I love that it's a great love story. And there is a lot more going on because there is the war, there are the racial persecutions, there is the Holocaust. And there are lots of very sort of heavy and hard to deal with issues, but fundamentally, it's a fantastic love story of I nonni di David. So that's in it, and that's what also makes it beautiful and uplifting despite all the other things that go on along with it. So I'm very excited to listen to David and the journey that took him to complete this work. And I would like now to ask you to welcome a very dear colleague of mine with whom we love to prepare programs like this, and they are never dull and never boring if she's involved. Please welcome the director of the Centro Primo Levi here in New York, Dr. Natalia Endrimi. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, David, and thank you, Richard Wolffe, who accepted to be in the conversation, and seems a fantastic match. Thanks to Casa Italiana, that has been for now almost 20 years, very close partners, and it is rare to find colleagues with whom we can work this way, and so I just want to say it's an important thing today. I'll start by introducing our two guests. So what you'll see here tonight is David Modigliani. He's an award-winning documentarist. His 2019 film, Running with Beto, a behind-the-scene portrait of the U.S. Senate candidate Beto O'Rourke, premiered on HBO. His films are featured on Mubi and Netflix, and Pack One Bag is a podcast, as we heard from Stefano, evoking old radio plays, and recounts his journey tracing the story of his grandparents fleeing Italy following the promulgation of the racial laws in 1938 and arriving to the United States. Richard Wolffe is an Emmy Award-winning executive producer. He has worked closely with chef and humanitarian José Andrés. His articles appeared in the Financial Times, Newsweek, and The Guardian, and is the author of two books, The Renegade, The Making of a President on President Barack Obama, and Relentless, My Story of the Latino Spirit That is Transforming America, in collaboration with Luis Miranda. We are very, very grateful that we have David and Richard, among other things, are friends, and this is always the best way to present a program and a story. I won't take much time, but I want to say a few things on how I met David. He contacted the Centro. As you know, our material, we are the ones who tell the story of Italian Jews, or who tell the story of what happened in Italy between the end of the 19th century and the rise of fascism, and what this very small minority meant in the country, and how far back its history goes. And I know that tonight there is almost the complete Italian Jewish community in the United States gathering in this room. It's something I'm proud to say, because we are so few. So he came to us and had an initial idea of creating a fiction based on this correspondence between his grandparents at the moment. These are the letters they exchange at the moment of the departure, when they are separated for a short time. And my conversation, Alessandro Cassin, my colleague, was involved in the conversation. Our conversation was really about what do we do with history. And for us, that's what we do. I mean, we document history, we publish books, we make translations, we help the researchers accessing primary sources in archives, in places that sometimes are very difficult to reach, so that this history can be available also to non-professionals. And this was a real challenge. And I have to say, the conversation that ensued with that first contact was very pleasant and very instructive for us. We really came to see, okay, what is that people ask? How do people imagine? How does someone like David, who grew up in this country, who is far removed, but for whom at the same time his grandparents are very real, very, very much his daily life, but what does he imagine of that experience? And so we've been conversing on this, and this podcast is somehow, is also the result of a little bit of this exchange. The last thing that Franco Modigliani was, I didn't get to know him well, but he, at the beginning of the center in the late 1990s, we were helped very closely by Tullia Zevi. She was a real presence, and she was a real guidance. And every time she came, she was in touch with Franco, and it became a presence for us as well. And there was a specific episode in 2003 that truly marked the moment when Centro Primo Levi placed itself politically. And I'm not saying this in a militant way, but I think for Primo Levi, no human actions can be apolitical. And to pretend that is so will only leave us in a limbo, and it's not the place where we want to be. So what happened in 2003 is that the Anti-Defamation League awarded their most important prize to Silvio Berlusconi. And the reason was that Silvio Berlusconi had been one of the openly, who had made open, remarks on both anti-Semitic remarks and remarks, very positive remarks on Mussolini and the persecution of the Jews. And it was given this award. And this is very much also about history. I mean, how, we can be people can be extremely light. And at the time, I think none of the people at the Anti-Defamation League wanted to, I don't think they understood what was happening, but seemed appropriate in that particular moment and convenient to do it, without considering the larger moral weight of this action. And I remember Tullia was in New York, and we had breakfast, and she said, yes, Franco called me, doesn't know what's going on. And we were all wondering what is going on. And the following day, a short article by Franco Modigliani appeared in the New York Times. It was a short op-ed. And I think it was a beginning of a history that we are, with which we are struggling today. And I want to read only the end of this op-ed because I think it was very courageous at the time, and he passed away a few days later. And for us was a very big lesson. So he wrote, quote, "Apparently, the Anti-Defamation League is giving Mr. Berlusconi its award because of his support of Israel and of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. But support of Israel should not be sufficient. In this case, it is bad for the Jews, it is bad for Italy, it is bad for the United States, and it is also bad for Israel." And it was prescient in many ways, and I think that for us it's something that links the center to your ground. That moment, really, we were at the award. I mean, it was a very disconcerting moment, and it's a moment when I think, as I felt, it was probably the last generation of Italians here who had a precise sense that there was anti-fascism and there was fascism. And the weight of his Nobel Prize and his career put it in the newspaper. So with that, I want to invite David and Richard to the stage. I thank you all, and I wish you a very nice evening. And please later join us for a glass of wine and a small reception, which was very generously offered by Mr. Marco Di Capua, who is David's cousin, and will be upstairs for a talk after the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. Richard will be up in a few minutes. I'm going to share a bit with you first. Thank you, Stefano, for welcoming me to Casa Italiano. Thank you, all of you, for coming out here. I'm the father of a 3-month-old baby, and the prospect of adult conversation is enough to bring me across the country. I slept just unbelievably last night, so full of energy to share with you. Thank you to Natalia and Alessandro. They were a huge help in the research phase of this project, especially. Thank you to my cousin Marco Di Capua for helping us with the reception later on, and to my friend Richard, who's going to join us in a bit as we get further into it. What I wanted to start with you was just to share the origins of this project and how it came about. And those of you that have listened to the first episode will know some of this, but I hope to share a little bit more in depth. So it was about 4 years ago that I'm opening this safe in my parents' home. My dad and I are looking for something that belonged to my grandfather, my nonno Franco. And in amongst my mom's jewelry, we found this red box. And inside of that, we found the medallion with the face of Alfred Nobel on it. And, I was only a 5-year-old kid when my white-haired grandfather, the nice guy with the accent who would get down on the rug and play with me sometimes, won the Nobel Prize in economics. And to most folks, that medallion in my hand is, an example of academic success. But to me, it has always felt like an emblem of survival. And that's because I grew up hearing about how my nonno Franco was just a 20-year-old kid when Mussolini passed the leggi razziali, the racial laws against Italian Jews like him. I grew up hearing about how confused he was, how he didn't know what to do, and how lucky he was to have fallen in love with this girl, Serena Calabi Modigliani. How her family had been planning for this moment for years, putting together an exit strategy, moving money outside of Italy to prepare for that moment, and how lucky Franco had been that when Serena's family decided to flee to Paris, they invited him to join them. I heard about how they made it onto the last boat out of mainland Europe before World War II broke out onto the Normandy. And as a kid, I was totally fascinated by my grandparents' romance on the run, by all this turmoil that they had escaped, just in the nick of time. And I kept telling myself that as I became a documentary filmmaker, that I was going to capture their story, that I would sit down with them for a week and in one place just capture all the anecdotes that they'd shared over the years. I could picture it, sitting down with them and them going over the stories again. But I didn't prioritize it. And then my nonni died. First, my nonno Franco, just after that episode with Berlusconi that probably killed him. And then later, my nonna Serena. And I will never get those tapes that I had always imagined I would record with them. But when my nonni died, they left behind this incredible gift for their grandchildren, this trove of love letters that contained all of their stories. And when I came to read those letters, I could hear their voices so distinctly. I had always done these little impersonations of them for my sister and my cousins, and I could imagine what that interview, would have sounded like, because, she would say, he would say, like,
Serena, please don't treat me like a child.
Franco, this morning you drove away with your briefcase on the roof of the car.
And so that interview in my mind sounded a little something like this.
Uno, due, tre, si? Okay, I keep talking. Yes, my name is Serena Calabi Modigliani, and yes, I'm giving you permission to use these letters that Nonno Franco and I wrote to each other while we were escaping Mussolini and so on. But, David, on the condition you promised me that you don't share these letters until I die.
What about me?
Okay, then, until both of us die, Franco and I.
Hopefully me first.
Why you?
Because I couldn't bear life without you, Serena.
And so you want me to bear it without you instead? Always to bear everything for both of us?
Serena, hopefully we die at the same time, okay? At the exact same time. Does that make you happy?
I gotta say, I understand why my grandmother maybe didn't want to share. I understand why she didn't want to share those letters.
Franco, you were at times a literary pornographer.
Well, it's all very tasteful.
So I couldn't look my grandchildren in the eye.
Like the nudes in the Sistine Chapel, very tasteful.
But I do... the dead don't... come si dice arrossire?
Blush.
Blush. The dead don't blush. And I do want my grandchildren to know this history, to know your history. That's why I'm sharing these letters with you, to show you how love got us through the horror of it all.
Love, yes, but also luck, Serena, because there is another side of this story. I mean, everyone we left behind, and everything we escaped.
And there was everyone that they left behind in Italy. Everything that they avoided here in the United States. And everything that they escaped back in Italy. Much of which would become the second half, especially, of the podcast that I would go on to make. My journey into my grandparents' fairy tale escape and the darker side of that story started back during the COVID lockdown in the spring of 2020. I was in the middle of a budding romance with a woman named Willa, and the pandemic had turned us into quarantine mates. Suddenly we were living together in this little pod as the whole world seemed to be on fire. And I'd actually told Willa about my grandparents' story on our first date. And when she asked about them again, wanting to know more, I thought about my copies of their love letters that were sitting in my filing cabinet. Nonna Serena had even translated a lot of them into English just before she died. The letters had been a kind of source of guilt and sorrow, but Willa's curiosity felt infectious. And when we opened them up, they weren't quite what I'd expected. They weren't these sort of faded black and white mementos of a time gone by. Even back then in 2020, the fragility of my grandparents' political situation felt, their questions to each other about how to deal with rising fascism and intolerance, all of that felt very vivid and immediate. So as I read their letters, I found myself wanting to ask them questions, not for some historical record, but just to understand my present moment. Like if a strong man starts to other groups of people and invite political violence, what do you do? If fascism takes over your country, do you stay or do you try to flee? And how do you know when to make that choice? It's not like I was packing my bags yet, but I did want to understand, how do you plan for it and how do you get out? And I also had a question for my bright and beautiful quarantine mate, Willa, which is what happens to relationships that are forged when the world's on fire. My nonni were gone, and these questions, they couldn't answer these questions. Neither could the letters in my hands. But the person who knew my nonni best was very much alive. My dad didn't just have a safe in his house with the Nobel Prize in it. He also had a kind of archive, 19 boxes of my grandparents' documents, most of which he'd never opened. The first boxes that I opened with my dad were full of letters from kind of high-powered pen pals, Jimmy Carter, Ted Kennedy, President Clinton.
Dear Serena and Franco, thank you for these kind words of encouragement. Together, I do think we can get these economic reforms through Congress.
But these letters weren't really a surprise, and I was opening them hoping to learn more about who my nonni really were before the war and how they got out. So when my dad and I took a break from the boxes, we went over the facts. And I knew that my nonna Serena's family had been ready to flee the country, and that somehow Franco had gotten an invitation to come along. In August of 1939, they'd boarded a famous French ocean liner called the Normandie. Welcome, thank you. And that arrived in New York Harbor just days before Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began. I'd always been amazed by this timing, how my grandparents got off the European continent just before it was engulfed in war. But what I didn't fully understand was what my nonno Franco had left behind when Serena's parents offered him this chance to escape. My dad explained that Franco had left behind his mother. There's his mother, Olga, his brother, Giorgio, and all of his cousins and aunts and uncles. My dad said that departure from the coast of France ultimately split our family apart. It landed your grandparents in New York and isolated them from everyone they left behind in Italy. When the war broke out, and that disconnect became 5 long years in which Franco had no news from his family, just reading about the war in the New York Times, listening to American radio stations broadcast that the Nazis had invaded and occupied his hometown of Rome. Eventually getting word of the systematic mass murder of European Jews. It's getting late when my dad and I decide to open up one more box from the day, and finally we find 2 things that do surprise me. The first one makes me sit down in disbelief, because in box number 5, we find a letter to my nonna Serena's father from some guy named Benito Mussolini. My dad points out his signature, and I'll come back to that one. Because then, inside of box number 3, we find a 25-page letter written in Italian, which my dad identifies as being from his uncle, Giorgio, the older brother that Franco had left behind in Rome. It's dated November 1944, and it starts, Questa è la prima lettera che vi spedisco direttamente, e sono tante le cose da raccontarvi. This is the first letter I'm sending you directly, and there are so many things to tell you. Giorgio explains to his brother that he, Giorgio, and his little family are still alive. And then he details how they've made it through the Nazi occupation of Rome. Here's one passage from the middle of the letter. We walked 3 hours or more with tortured souls, soaked to the bone, with feet rotted by water and mud, while the poor children looked at us speechless, sensing the difficulty of the destiny that awaited us. Every time I lifted my foot from the slimy mud to take another step, I seemed to feel reliving within me the wandering Jew as he advances always in search of a refuge, a place which will still not be final for him. Reading Giorgio's letter is like hearing from a parallel universe, a version of what might have happened to my nonni if they hadn't escaped Italy. But this letter was only a start. I had so much to learn about the other side of my nonni's story, about who and what they had left behind, about how it all went down, about why we had letters from the future dictator of Italy just sitting in my parents' basement. I knew that Giorgio's children were still alive in Rome. My cousin Paola, her brother Enrico. And I knew that I'd already failed to record my nonni before they died, but I did not have to make the same mistake twice. If I wanted to answer the questions about my grandparents and their families, I knew I had to pack a bag and travel back over the ocean my grandparents had crossed on the Normandy. Had to go back to Italy. When I called Willa from my parents' house to tell her, I said I'd need to be there for a month or two and I'd need some crew or at least an audio engineer. And that's when she said, or I could do it. She was making this generous offer to put her own projects on pause and use the audio skills she'd learned in film school to help me uncover my family's story on the ground. I gotta say, I felt pretty anxious about this. Like, is this a good idea? Like mixing my budding romance with uncovering parts of my family's history that I'm unsure about. But Willa's curiosity was a big part of the reason that I'd started digging back into this story in the first place. And it felt right to keep going together. So I said yes, and we committed to the adventure ahead with no idea just how far it would take us. When we touched down in Rome in 2021, I reached out to a former student of my grandfather's, an Italian who'd studied with him at MIT. And he said, "Oh, how lovely to hear from you. I'm actually working with Mario now, another former student of your nonno's." I said, "Mario? Who is Mario?" And I Googled Franco Modigliani, student Mario, and then it auto-populated Draghi. Like, oh, right, the Prime Minister of Italy at the time. And I wrote back and said, well, you guys must be extremely busy running the country. And he wrote back right away and said, no, ho parlato con Mario. I spoke with Mario. And he says, you have to come to the office to see us. So the next day, Willa and I roll up to the office, which was Palazzo Chigi, kind of like the Italian White House, surrounded by these policemen. We've got our headphones and our audio gear. We walk up to two of them, and I say, buongiorno, abbiamo un riunione con Mario Draghi. We have a meeting with Mario Draghi. And one of the policemen says to the other in Italian, yeah, and then I have a meeting with the Pope. Like, who are these guys? Eventually, their superior confirms that we are on the security list, and we get in, and we did have a wonderful interview with the Prime Minister, who spoke very movingly about my grandparents' romance and relationship, and also about my grandfather as a mentor. But he couldn't shed very much light on Franco's early years in Rome, which is what we were really after. And he pointed us, just like Natalia and Alessandro did, to the Archivio Centrale dello Stato in Rome. And that, the Central State Archives there, is where we made many of the discoveries that you'll hear about in the podcast. First, we have to contextualize them for a moment, which is that question, why do we have those letters from Mussolini in the basement? So it turns out that my grandmother's father, Giulio Calabi, was known as Il Re dei Libri, the king of the books, because he had formed in Bologna the biggest book distribution business in Italy. That allowed him to build this villa on the hill outside of Bologna, and his business contacts around Europe were part of what gave him access and information and resources to eventually flee the country. But back in 1914, when the king of the books was just starting out, Benito Mussolini was a young lefty journalist, right? He was editor-in-chief of Avanti, the biggest socialist newspaper in the country. And when Mussolini favored Italy getting into the First World War, the Socialist Party expelled him, and he lost his gig at the newspaper. And he basically said, well, screw you guys, I'm going to start my own newspaper. But he wasn't quite sure how to manage that endeavor or how to fund it. And he needed money to get it done. So these letters in my dad's boxes, They showed how my great-grandfather, the king of the books, advised Mussolini on launching his startup newspaper, distributed the first editions of that paper, and even funneled a secret subsidy from the French government to help fund the whole endeavor. But in the archives, we saw how after Mussolini's hard right turn and his ascent to power, Il Duce had turned against my great-grandfather. We saw how fascist intelligence officers began surveilling Giulio Calabi, opening and reading his mail, accusing him of hostile sentiments against the regime, confiscating his passport for a period of time. How even during the 9 months that he spent in Paris with my grandparents on the run, there were French spies writing back to the writing reports back to Roman intelligence officers about everything that he was doing in exile. In the archives, we also found the thick application that Nonno Franco's mother had made to the race division of the internal ministry for discriminazione, requesting an exemption from the racial laws based on benemerenze or merits. An entire folder that compiled this high-achieving family's documentation all in one place, kind of like a whole family applying to college together for this sickening supplication to the regime. And these documents confirm the depths of Franco's mother's relationship with the Fascist Party, where she held multiple positions, and also showed us the awards from Franco's own youth from the Fascist Party, complexities which you hear about more in the podcast. But the most powerful experience in Italy was reconnecting with my family members on the ground, Franco's niece and nephew, who took us back to the small town of Velletri, the town where they had hidden as children. They told us about hiding from bombs, learning their fake names and identities, remembering the rope game their father used to play with them, an escape drill to get out of the safe house where they were hiding. Through their stories and more family letters and diaries, we reconstructed the whole experience up through the liberation of Rome, when they reclaimed their real names, and the kids took the chewing gum from American soldiers and ate it by accident because they'd never had it before. Across 4 years of work, and with thanks to several of you in this room for supporting this project, we turned all of this material into a 10-episode podcast with a lovely assist from Signore Tucci, who brings Il Re dei Libri, the King of the Books, to life in the podcast. And it's worth sharing, as a spoiler alert, a small spoiler, the only one for those of you that haven't made it through, that of course this journey brought Willa and I a whole lot closer together. Last year, we were married at her parents' house in Santa Fe, and just 3 months ago, we welcomed our bambino, Marcello Vita, who has quite a story waiting for him when he grows up. Thank you. I'd love to... Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd now love to invite up my friend and mentor, Richard Wolffe, an incredible storyteller. I'm very glad he's here. And we'll chat a bit.
Great job. Thank you. Do we really need these? Yes, for the record. Yes, we do.
Hello, hello.
1, 2, West. Yes, yes, yes.
Fantastic. I think you maybe chose the wrong career. You should have done voice acting.
My friend Justin Krebs, who was in my college improv group, was here, and it's been about 20 years since I had done those voices.
Excellent, Bill Clinton, in case we need one. So, if I'm not at all objective, David is a friend, the podcast is wonderful. If you haven't listened to it, you absolutely should. I think that's the main message.
Yeah, that's the message.
The main message is listen to this outstanding podcast. It's a great honor to be here, obviously with David and with you all, Casa Italiana, and the Centro Primo Levi. I have to say, Primo Levi was an inspiration to me reading his books as a kid and as not a kid as well, and so you should read Primo Levi. Everyone should. I want to start, because you covered a lot of territory, with a question of identity. You tell a story very early on about your grandfather accepting the Nobel Prize wearing the Italian sash.
Yeah.
in spite of everything he's gone through and his family has gone through. And then later on, much later on, in the podcast, you tell a story about Mussolini being thrown out of power and the busts being destroyed in the street, and some journalists asking Italian Jews, how do you feel? And they say, we feel Italian. So how do you reconcile this? How do you reconcile feeling Italian, feeling so proud of being Italian that you would wear the sash at this peak of your career, winning the Nobel Prize, with everything that Italy had done to your family in the name of Italian nationalism?
It's a great question, and as I looked at that photo of my grandfather with like the 30 Nobel Prize winners all in white tie and tails, and he was the only one that had put this green sash, wanting to show that he was accepting it as American, but that he felt Italian. And I have to say that the short answer is that I think that part of it is the privilege of not having experienced what his brother and his cousins had been through. And to be entirely honest, I think probably not ever truly deeply confronting what they had been through. I was sort of startled in reading the autobiography that he published first in Italian and then it was translated in the US, to see that he had gotten a lot of details of his brother's story, which he summarized in a couple of paragraphs in this whole book, which is okay, it was mostly about him, wrong. He said they spent they stayed with a different family every night, and these families all took them in and were willing to offer them food and shelter. And it's true that they were certainly, his brother's family were helped by these farmers who you hear about in episode 6 of the podcast, in this small town of Velletri, and certainly by many, many others, including a woman who rushed out from Rome the day after the Jewish ghetto was invaded, 8 months pregnant, to warn the people in Velletri that the Germans were coming after not just men, but women and children. But I think that my grandparents absorbed to some degree this kind of myth of the Italiani brava gente, the notion of the kind-hearted Italian, the idea promulgated after the war that the Italians had sort of been manipulated by the bad Germans, and that so to read that my grandfather had sort of gotten those details wrong, to know that they had here in New York when he was at the New School kind of passed as no one knew there was such a thing as Italian Jews. As Natalia said, we're all here tonight. So to be Franco Modigliani, you're Italian, you're probably Catholic. And so they were certainly dealing with anti-Italian sentiment at that time. We saw the slides, relating to being enemy aliens and so on, but passing as not Jewish. And so I think to that degree, and then ultimately also arguing, as you hear in the 10th episode, with his brother and cousins who are thinking about going to Palestine after the war in 1945. Rome is a disaster. They're thinking about leaving, and he's basically arguing against them going there. And I think he has his reasons, but part of that is also not truly understanding the anti-Semitism that they had faced and experienced, and the horror of that. So I think that he felt able to be pride through some fanciful compartmentalization. Now, how about me is a good question, and I'm not sure the answer to that. I mean, I guess I think of it in the same way that my grandfather always thought about being American, which is this is an imperfect place that is striving to live up to its ideals. And we can be proud to be American while criticizing our country. And certainly he spent a long time criticizing Italy from the outside in this kind of loving way.
Okay, so this is a very personal podcast, so you'll have to excuse the personal questions. But did you feel Italian as the grandchild? Did you? How Italian did you feel? How much is that part of your identity as well?
That's a great question. I think that I came to feel Italian when, as Stefano said, I went to Italy for the first time and reconnected with some of my family on the ground there. Claudio Fano, whose cousin Andrea Milano is here tonight, telling me the story of what he'd been through as an Italian Jew, reconnecting with that family. But I was 14 then, and I think in subsequent visits, I did feel that I understood why I was using my hands so much, and that I also found that I sounded like a low-flying airplane, like that the American accent, you kind of realize that we're kind of like pretty much in here, and the Italians have this incredible, and I just felt like I was this plane flying through their beautiful operatic.
A bit boring.
Yeah. But then I felt that it loosened me up, and I was like, oh, maybe I'm an Italian trapped inside of an American body. And I did feel more at home there in many ways. And I'm so lucky to have all these cousins there now who embraced us when we went back in multiple, reporting trips to work on the book. And that made me feel, like an Italian trapped in an American's body.
So lots of characters to get through here, and we saw some of that in the wonderful slideshow. As your grandfather, what was Franco like? Because you describe him in his story, in his romance, he's a romantic, right?
Oh, yes.
As il tipo ridicolo. So he's obviously a serious economist, but there seems to be something edgier as well.
Yes. He was ridicolo. I mean, truly ridicolo. One of the late memories that I have from him is when he answered the door. He was already in his 80s, and he was wearing a bicycle helmet. And I was like, no, did you start bicycling?
No. I fell down yesterday. I scraped my elbow. I'm fine. But what if I hit my head? I could damage my brain. I have to protect my brain.
And my grandmother was like, he's been wearing the helmet for 3 days. And he was just wearing this bicycle helmet, like he wore it for a couple of weeks and then he gave up. But that was totally his thing. And the reason, by the way, that the briefcase was on the roof of the car was because he had one day arrived at MIT realizing that he was missing his briefcase, which had this paper that he had written that was not on a laptop, but whatever. So he drove back home, got his backup briefcase, put it on the roof of the car as an experiment because he figured he would see where in his commute it flew off the car.
And of very course, scientific.
He arrived at MIT having completely forgotten what he was doing and lost the second briefcase also. So he was ridiculous in that way. But I have to say, more seriously, what I most took away from him was that he was an intellectual omnivore. He was reading novels, poetry. He, obviously had deep facility with mathematics, but was also interested in the practical implications of economics. He was involved politically when you talk about the writing to the New York Times and so on. The ACLU, both my grandparents were involved in. So there was that European kind of renaissance and intellectual interest across the board. And also he was just incredibly curious. Like my friends would come over I'd bring a couple of friends home from college for Passover, something like that, and they would be thinking, I'm going to be sitting next to the Nobel Prize guy, and I got to think. And then I'd turn over, and he's just grilling them about their term paper and what they're writing it on, and he's like 13 questions deep into, whatever history paper that my friend is writing, and he would always had a deep curiosity about other people and what they were doing.
So why did your grandmother put up with him?
It's a good question.
How did she put up with him?
Yeah, because he was romantic in that way. He would screw up, and then he would just make up songs. He would be singing songs to her, in a very off-key, Serena, how can you be angry when I love you so much? Just like constantly sort of unforgivably twinkly and charming. And I think also because she was super ambitious as well. And her father had gotten that green sash as the as a cavaliere, Gran Cavaliere della Croce, a Knight of the Italian Cross, how 50, 60 years before her future husband did, she had this sense of scope and ambition and sort of what was possible, and she demanded that of him. He actually wrote in his autobiography that they were on vacation. This was after he'd won the Nobel Prize in Italy. They were near Bologna, where my grandmother grew up. They pulled into a small gas station, and she went inside. And he saw her through the window laughing with the guy behind the register and then hugging the guy behind the register. She came back out, got into the car, and he said, well, who was that? And she said, it was a boy I was interested in high school. And he said, well, okay. He was clearly jealous, and he was like, but you must be happy you are married to the guy with the Nobel Prize. And she said, Franco, don't be an idiot. If I had married him, he would have won the Nobel Prize. So I think, she was running the show, is the bottom line. He was a vehicle for her. Obama tells the same story maybe in your book. So who knows if either of those stories are true, but that's what I heard. Yeah.
Serena's father,
yes,
the king of books, you didn't have much time to talk about him, but he's the reason you're here.
Yes.
He is an extraordinary businessman and character. Just give us a couple of minutes sketching out his life, what he achieved, and how he had the means to bring you all to safety.
Yeah. I mean, this is a guy, I think it's worth saying that 1870-ish is when ultimately, I mean, the academics will correct me, but more or less when the church and state were separated, and the Italian Jews were more or less led out of the ghettos and liberated. And he was sort of part of the first wave of that. He was born 15 years later, just a year after Mussolini, and had the opportunity to basically be part of a very inclusive Italy that was much more meritocratic. He had the benefit of his wife, the woman he married's family, being deeply involved in the publishing business. Her uncle was the first publisher of Pinocchio. And through some capital and contacts from them, and inspired by Hachette, publishing your book coming out shortly, he wanted to become, he thought he could create the Italian Hachette. There was no sort of central distribution of books, magazines, especially of foreign press. And he realized if he made something big enough and fast enough, they could occupy that space. He created the Messaggerie Italiane. He ascended very quickly in terms of that company grew extremely quickly. They made a catalog of catalogs so that all the booksellers had access to understanding what publications were available from abroad, and then they, of course, carried all of that out, a little bit like Amazon before its time. And I think he really, it was the murder of Matteotti in 1924, when Mussolini essentially had his political rival, depending on what you believe. I mean, either he wanted him kidnapped and he wound up killed, or he wanted him dead. That was so shocking to my great-grandfather that he said, if Mussolini continues down this path, there is no future for us in this country. And that's when he started moving money out of the country to Switzerland. My grandmother remembers going on some of these weekend trips where they were literally carrying gold, and money with them in their pockets. But it has always been stunning to me that he made that realization in 1924 and started making an exit strategy, a backup plan. And it wasn't until 14 years later, we're all thinking what are we going to do? What happens with the election? It was 14 years later that he eventually made good on that plan, and left the country. But there's no question, I think, to your point, something that my wife Willa has observed is that he often, power and privilege, I think, blind us to what could happen to us, what is possible, right? And powerful folks think they'll be fine because they're powerful. And yet, because I think of all of the relationships that he had around Europe and the publishing community and his sense of what was happening in other countries, he was able to imagine where things might go. And so when the racial laws were promulgated, it was, I mean, they were out of there incredibly quickly. And he actually sold his company a month beforehand based on the kind of insider knowledge that this was, going to happen. So he had not only the foresight, but the vulnerability, the humility, the information to believe what could happen and to act on it.
That's extremely rare.
Totally.
The central question of your podcast is, would you flee? What happens if you can't flee? And there's this awful moment when the Nazis come into Rome and the Roman Jewish community has this ransom. It's hard to describe it in any other way, and a conflict within the community, which is not unusual at all, between people saying we have to fight, we have to flee, versus it's not going to be that bad, right? They just want the money and they're going to leave us alone. In other words, the money will protect us.
Yeah.
And your great-grandfather does not think that. And that, you could say, well, he had the awareness, but was there something of his character, something in the family history that also gave them that perspective? Because you also talk about, the Passover not meaning something to you, and then feeling this sense of, around your family, of being hunted.
Yeah.
Was there a sense, either after leaving Italy or before, of being persecuted and being ready to leave? Because many, many, many people obviously didn't have that feeling.
Right. Yeah, that moment, that's sort of after, when the Nazis have already occupied Rome, and they give this demand for gold to the Jewish community on the pain of deporting hostages, and the Jewish community comes up with this money in a very short period of time. And there is a debate, in the community, will this pay them off, or do we need to get out of here? And it was kind of the last chance to go before the raid in the Jewish ghetto and beyond. At that point, my family was, my grandparents, they were already gone, to your point, with Giulio having taken them out. I think to him personally, part of it, and this is somewhat speculation, was that he had this personal relationship with Mussolini. He had, in these letters, sort of showing how he had this relationship and then broken with Mussolini. And you see Mussolini basically yelling at him in these letters. You're putting too severe limitations on me, and and you can sort of see. So I don't know if this would have been like someone who worked with Donald Trump on The Apprentice, and sort of like, oh, this guy's the president? I know how this is gonna go. That his personal relationship might have given him some insight as to just how far it could go. I think that's possible. But I mostly believe that it was, inside of, there was a reason that Mussolini and the fascists were so determined to try to keep foreign press out of the country, and there are scholars who know much, much more about this, but the censorship that was happening in the newspaper, the propagandizing that was happening to Italians, that it was a privilege to have just good information, to have just a general sense of reality outside of your filter bubble, outside of whatever news that you're getting. And I think he had that because of his contacts around Europe, and that gave him, I think, the sense of what was possible.
And he's a news addict. He is a
news junkie. Yes, totally.
So a lot of the podcast is about Franco's brother, who does not flee.
Yes.
And there's this. You frame it in terms of who can flee, who has the ability to flee. Explain why Giorgio did not leave.
Yeah. Yeah, and you hear, and one of the things that was most powerful to me, and this is sort of the beginning of episode 4 of the podcast, was that I had always thought, if you knew that this might happen, why would you not just get out of there? And my cousin Paola really helped me understand that it's not as simple as just wanting to go. You know, that if you have an elderly relative you're taking care of, do you have the money to get out? Do your parents speak another language? Could they work in another country, or would they need to get recertified? Like all of the obstacles to an inertia that is involved in actually getting out of somewhere. And I think that in some ways, Giorgio, his older brother, you know, he had a young child, he had a wife, he was a bit more established, and he had a job actually working for the Ministry of Agriculture. It was connected to the government. And I also think that he was possibly more swayed by their mother, La Mamma Fascista, as she was known in the family, who had been a member of the Fascist Party since 1929, and who, you know, essentially didn't believe that this was really going to apply to her, a good fascist, that this wasn't really going to, how could this party that she had served and been part of, how was they really going to turn on her? Well, maybe some Jews, but not us, you know, that kind of attitude. And that's part of why she filed this application I showed you just the beginning of, this application for an exemption from the racial laws, that, hey, if I can show we were members of the party and we did this and we did this, like we're going to get this exemption. I think he believed that that could possibly happen. But ultimately, when he then realized that he really needed to get out of there, Giorgio, he sought out a plan B through the Vatican, which is a kind of a longer story and is part of the bonus stuff. But David Kurtzer, who's written incredible books based on what he's been finding in the Vatican archives, found these documents that showed that Giorgio had gone to the Vatican through a family contact and had actually gotten so far as to get a recommendation for a visa to, I believe it was Ecuador, but that he had sent, when his mother, La Mamma Fascista, who fled to Palestine in 1939 with her sisters, he had given to her basically his meager life savings so that she could work on a visa so that he could also come to Palestine. And he needed money to show Ecuador that he would not become a ward of the state, basically showing that you were financially, independent. But the war had broken out since then, and the money was basically trapped inside of Palestine. So he did not have a way to show that he had the capital. So he sort of had this Hail Mary through the Vatican that actually might have worked, but he couldn't execute against it. And then when that happened, and then when the application for discriminazione was rejected nearly 2 years later, we know about Italian bureaucracy, but that was a long thing. It came back rejected. That kind of sealed the deal. Not only was he trapped inside the country, he didn't have this exemption.
So I'm not going to hog the conversation. Be prepared that we're going to do questions, right? Yes. Okay. So be prepared with some questions while I run through a few more with David. The podcast itself, you are a visual storyteller, and this thing is audio. So in spite of all the great voices you do, how much of a challenge was it adapting the way you work to this format?
It was totally new and extremely uncomfortable. I come from a documentary film background. This was the first audio project that I had made. But I'm a huge consumer of audio. I listen to it probably more than I watch documentaries. And I knew that this material didn't want to be a documentary film. It could be, but it would be a very kind of Ken Burnsian vibe, not the kind of cinema verite that I would be more interested in. The principal folks were gone. And a collaborator of mine said very early on in the process, podcasting is a visual medium. I was like, what are you talking about? Where is it? There literally are no visuals. And he said, no, well, you are creating the world in the mind of the listener. That the listener is building the reality inside their mind in a way that's much more similar to reading. And our job is to provide essentially a guided meditation that is building the visuals inside of them. And that helped me realize that a podcast, what I wanted so much to do was to make this history feel lived in and feel immediate and not feel like this faded black and white thing that we could look at from a distance comfortably. And especially in the second half of the podcast, where we could do a lot more sound design and where we had the benefit of my cousin Piero's diary and Giorgio's letter and this real blow-by-blow of what they were going through, I realized that audio could actually be a much more immersive medium than something visual.
Okay, and Stanley Tucci, how did you get him?
The Tucci. The short version is I had met him several years ago when he was about to make his Searching for Italy show. He asked me he asked me to direct it. I think they had fired the director and they were 3 weeks out from shooting. And he was looking for someone. He had seen our Beto film. I got an email, could you speak with Stanley Tucci? It was like, I think I'll make a little time. We had this 2-hour conversation. I told him basically this story, what I knew of it at the time, and that was my connection to Italy. And he said, could you direct this series? And I set about, that was on a Friday, I set about trying to figure out how I could make life work to do that. And on Monday, he called back incredibly apologetic and said, I've realized there's no way we can get you a visa to legally work on this fast enough. They were already on CNN's insurance and they couldn't, So it's either that or they had just found another director, who knows. But he was so apologetic, and it was like we were exchanging emails, and it was that thing where the natural rhythm of the thing should have been over, but he kept following up. And I was like, you're Stanley Tucci, you don't need to, I get it, you're sorry, it's fine, we're good. And so I felt like there was an open door there. And as I say in the podcast, I truly do, when I think of the king of the books and this sort of debonair publisher and this guy that's sort of, going to get his family out of Dodge, and it really seemed like a Stanley Tucci type. And I was like, oh, I know, I have his email address. So I had written a sort of a treatment, as Natalia referenced, actually a fictionalized version of this story, which I sent to him. And I think the other key here, as it was for me and Willow, was COVID, because he was kind of just at home. And so he read the treatment, he wrote back 2 days later, like, this is fascinating, and I'm in, and how can I help? And I said, well, you could executive produce it, and you could, lend your voice to it. And he went in and did some test recordings for us a couple weeks after that. It took much longer for us to then develop the material for him, and we ultimately went to London twice, where he lives, to record all of it. But his grandparents are Italian, his parents are Italian, but he had that voice from Jump Street. I mean, he just went right into it, and he was just conjuring it. It was quite impressive.
So you guilted him into it, which is
very
the most Jewish Catholic thing you could do.
Yeah, exactly.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. I have to reference Primo Levi because he's a hero of mine. Primo Levi writes, he talked about fascism being a sort of virus that is dormant but will always be there and resurface. You talked about doing the podcast because, COVID, and your sense of this was a story you didn't get around to doing. But was there also a reason to do it now because of the context we're in?
Absolutely. My grandmother, I remember how upset she was after 9/11, after the Patriot Act, and talking about how Americans did not understand how hard these civil liberties were to come by, and how easily they were lost, and how hard they would be to claw back. And I just was imagining them. This was like in the run-up to the 2020 election, when Trump was sort of preceding the idea that this was going to be rigged and the only way we could lose, and inviting political violence and all of that. And it really filled me with questions of what do we do if this all gets worse, goes south, expands, if the virus, reaches more people. And so that was a huge part of the why now, and feeling like maybe my grandparents' letters and stories had some answers for us, and that maybe by exploring the way that they had navigated rising fascism, rising intolerance of Jews, weakening democracies, that if I could explore and share that story, it might offer something to others, who had those same questions.
Fantastic. Okay, questions. Are we going to just do a show of hands, pass a microphone?
We have a mic for this,
Okay.
so we're going to pass a mic. I just
Please.
Two short comments. I do not think that we can in any way not equate, but even create a parallel between the people who left Italy in 1938 and the people who were in Rome in 1943. It's not that some believed and thought that money would save them and some did not. About 2,500 Jews left Italy because they were able, they had contacts, they could imagine to go away, but it was really very, very difficult thing to do. They were people who, to some degree, already had connections elsewhere and could, find the money to. I mean, we have stories of families where there are 40 people, and so only the children will go, and everybody else died. So that was one decision. Rome, 1943. This is a community that didn't debate, should we accept or not accept. They had no choice. This was an extremely impoverished community. This was one of the poorest communities in Italy. When the president of the community faced, the possibility, okay, can we leave? Now, leaving means that the wealthy will leave, but the wealthy already left. Mm-hmm. And we're going to live here, these very large families with a lot of elderly and children who cannot even feed themselves. And so that was a completely different. Mm-hmm. And yes, they managed to find this money. It was, they had no choice. They did it. I don't think that, when you listen to see the documents, what people wrote at the time, they could have not done it. It's a very different situation. And secondly, a lot of people applied for the discrimination of from being declared exempted from the racial laws. I think most of people in this room would, mm-hmm. under the same condition. We would all try to see, okay, it's something so absurd, maybe there are ways. And also the government set up this system, both the discrimination, the Aryanization that was in fact propelled by the church, as a way to extort money. This was a huge scam. And the same people, there were lawyers ready. So I don't think that meant anything. We cannot make any assumption on why or what kind of person did this. I think we would all do the same. Mm-hmm. And everybody who could, because it was a very expensive thing to do. Another, that made it, people tried mm-hmm. and thought, maybe this will pass soon. But just to put our feet on the ground.
Yeah. That's great. Okay. Questions? Do you want to raise a hand and then we'll get a mic? Gentleman right here.
So I'm Marco Di Capo. I'm actually the son of immigrants, who saw the handwriting on the wall and emigrated to Ecuador, of all places. I have an existential question. Why the podcast today and not 25 years ago when the memories were still alive? Why is that it's taken this long to come to terms to what happened in Italy in 1938 with the racial laws? It's something that's been bothering me because the memories now are on paper. They're no longer, in a sense, alive on people who can speak to it. So do you have any answer to that?
Sure. So 25 years ago, I was 19. And I don't think I had an appreciation when I was 19 of the importance of this story. I think that I grew up during a very privileged period when it really did seem like the end of history, right? Like we were just going to march toward an ever more democratic, ever more inclusive, ever more tolerant, less racist society. And, I watched Barack Obama get elected. I watched, whatever it was. And I think it was around the time that I pulled these letters out when I realized that history was not marching on in that way, that the return and the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, that the return of these cycles of authoritarianism around the world meant that, you know, we're in this vicious cycle again. And so I realized that the privilege that I had experienced in my upbringing was really an intermission, you know, rather than a whole new era. And that's what made me realize that it was this was more than just a family story, but something that I, you know, could dig into and tell more about myself.
And I have a little bit perspective on that too. So I'm going to take off my moderator hat and put on my book author hat, because being a little bit older than David, the first book I published was actually about 25 years ago, about Holocaust compensation. It was called The Victim's Fortune. At the time, at the end of the Cold War, there was a moment when the archives across the other side of the Iron Curtain were being opened, and we didn't have the same conflict with Russia as there is today, and there was a sense that the last survivors, who even in that time were mostly the children who'd survived, they were disappearing at an incredibly fast rate. And that's when you start seeing, for instance, the US Holocaust Museum being established in Washington. Great museum, you should go visit if you haven't. Within the stories that we covered, and I was a young reporter at the Financial Times then, actually we did write a little bit about Italy because of the insurance company Generali and its role as pretty much the dominant player in issuing life insurance to the people who died in the camps, and then refusing to pay out anything. But the Italian Jewish community did not feature greatly because of the size of the community, and because of the numbers involved and therefore the amount of compensation. So where the Italian story really came into play in that period, 25 years ago, was more about the financial connections, the business connections through fascism and National Socialism, but less to do with the size of the community, because the focus at that time was really especially on what they called the double victims. So survivors who had been on the other side of the Iron Curtain had received nothing, and they were still alive. And their stories had been erased because there were no Jews in the Soviet Union. They were all communists. You can go and see the only memorial to Soviet Jewry is outside Riga in the forest there, where they massacred the Riga Jews. That was the only one in all of the years of the Soviet Union. So there was a focus on the Jews emerging from communism, on the larger populations, and I think the Italian Jewish story was really overlooked as a result. And to the extent that Italy was wrapped up in that period, it was the corporate responsibility.
If I may add, sorry, I'm a pain in the neck here, but I think we should not think that, and just to clarify, the will to investigate what happened to the Jews in Italy or elsewhere in Europe was not sparked by, I mean, this question of restitution is very late in the game.
No, he was asking why 25 years ago. 25 years ago was a moment.
No, but in fact, 25 years ago, maybe just a little more, you know, a little more, like in Italy particularly, happened in 1988, when with the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the racial laws, the archives, the state archives, began to be open. I mean, what really, and the first wave of research happened because people started to look for their families. I mean, there is a huge amount of research. The CEDEC in Italy is based on the archive that was created because of the people were searching for family members. So there have been many stages of this. Italy has certainly been very slow in acknowledging the persecution, but there have been, I think, certainly since the late 80s, there has been a lot of research. The year that the center opened, we present Memoria, that was the first film on with the voices of survivors. Sorry for...
Okay, another question.
First, thank you. That was an extraordinary presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing the podcast. The big, ugly question right now is we have heard the word fascist, the F word, thrown around a lot in this country in the last 2 weeks in particular. What's your perspective? Most Americans, by the way, I don't believe would know what fascism means or what a fascist is. It's an easy word to throw around, but no one defines it. So how do you see where we are right now on the spectrum of fascism?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the second question is not a question, it's more a comment, the stay or go comment. My father was one of those Americans who went to Italy to fight fascism with the Fifth Army. And so I always think of it in that perspective that you stay and fight for something that you think is worth fighting for. So, but that's more of a personal reflection. I'd be interested in your answer about where you see us right now on the realm of the spectrum of fascism in this country.
Yeah. Well, I should qualify, I'm not a scholar of fascism, but as a private citizen and amateur storyteller, I mean, a few things. I'll maybe start with the second question as a way back into the first. I think that that question of stay or go, or fight or flee, is in part have to do with what group you are a part of as relates to the othering that is central to fascism. So as a Jewish person, whether it's 1938, 1943, whenever it is, but being part of the brunt of the othering, the scapegoating, that the strong man is animating the rest of the populace around. If you're part of that group that is being othered, then your calculation about whether to stay or go may be different from other members of the population. And if we look at our current moment, groups that are maybe being the brunt of othered might be more like migrants, transgender community than it is necessarily Jews in this particular iteration. And so that those groups may have different calculations about stay or go, or may have different levels of vulnerability. But yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty textbook what's going on right now. I think it is when I mentioned how it was 14 years after my great-grandfather sort of first started making an exit strategy, that it is early days and early stages in some way, and that we could still turn the car in the other direction and not go off the cliff. But I think the textbook components to me are the use of violence to achieve political ends, the othering and bullying and scapegoating of certain groups used to animate a populace, and telling that populace that they are being deprived of whatever wishes, goals, ends that they have because of this other group, which the strong man will stand up to protect them against, all feels pretty central. And I think that the lies and the J.D. Vance's answer in the vice presidential debate, and then his subsequent clear follow-up, just saying no about, the willingness to adhere to the objective falsehood and toe the line of that lie, in my view, is also part of that sort of mass movement that heads you down that path. So that's my personal view. Obviously, fascist movements are each as different from the other, so they can't be compared in a one-to-one basis. They certainly are apples and oranges. But I do think that Americans often reach for Hitler as the quick go-to when we think about authoritarianism, whereas Mussolini is perhaps a more instructive analog for Trump. When we think about the media manipulation, I mean, it was fascinating to understand how clearly Mussolini understood the media, how clearly as a headline writer, the ability to persuade, to cajole, to provoke, that sense of playing the media. Anyway, I mean, there's many analogs there that Mussolini is a rich place to look for when we think about American fascism. Yeah.
Okay, question back here.
Thank you, and I'm really happy to have been brought here by my friend. I happen to be Jewish, but not Italian, but I am a product of the Holocaust. And you just brought up a political issue in the midst of what happened in Italy in 1938 and 39. My parents were survivors who ended up in Tashkent, and I only learned about where they were the last year of my father's life when he told me where my sisters were born. When you discuss Donald Trump in terms of fascism, I am so in disagreement with you. Coming from my background, my father was part of the Communist Party in Poland, okay? When Hitler invaded Poland after his pact with Stalin, there were about 500,000 Jews, and about 250,000 Jews amongst 500,000 communists who fled into Eastern Europe. And if you want to read about it, read Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, who's a very great historian from Yale, which I read. It's a brutal book to read.
It's true. Timothy Snyder just talking today about how the fascist moment that we're currently in the United States of America.
Yes, and I'm in total disagreement with it if he thinks it's Trump. For me, Trump is Churchill. And for me, the left, and I'm a registered Democrat my entire life, okay, my entire adult life. For me, Trump is Churchill. For you, he's a fascist. For me, Kamala Harris and the entire left left me about 12, 14 years ago. So it's a matter of perspective. And my point in speaking, usually I don't speak at these things, my father said to me, the far right, the far left, they're equally as bad. It just matters as to which one is in ascension. And from my perspective, growing up and hearing him, and he was very, very political. I grew up as a news junkie because of him. Right now, for me, as a New Yorker, I see the left is too much in ascension. Okay, and I'm theater arts. I went to Performing Arts High School. I am not a conservative, right-leaning individual. Mm-hmm. I believe that everyone has the right to live their lives as they choose. But again, when I come to all of these type of things, I hear, oh, Trump's a fascist. No, he's not. And he's more for Jews than Kamala Harris is.
Okay.
So all of you need to begin to listen.
Do you have a question? Or okay.
Thank you very much.
Was there? Okay. I'm going to ask the questioners to frame a question. It's okay to express your thoughts, but please try and frame a question. Thank you.
Sure. David, congratulations on everything that you've done. My question is more personal to you. Talk to us about the sense of responsibility that you felt and kind of some of your worries and fears as you were trying to put this together. Could you pull it off, and would it do justice to these people? And was the public going to fall in love with these characters the way you obviously are and have so much affection for them? And you succeeded, but I just want to understand more about that process for you.
Yeah. I think I was... I was very worried. I mean, I'd made films, for example, Running with Beto that Natalia talked about, where it was like, Richard followed Barack Obama around behind the scenes. It's like, let's tell someone else's story and have them be vulnerable and them open up their lives to us and them allow cameras inside at their, most difficult moments. And I had never, I've only been making stuff for maybe 15 years, but I'd never made anything personal to me in any way. And so that was new in addition to the audio component. And also when I started off, I thought, well, it'll be personal, but it's just going to be about my grandparents and their family members. It's not going to be about me, myself. And thanks to Dustin, who's here, and other members of our podcast team that really encouraged me. Like, you got to put yourself in this, and you got to put your and Willa's story in this, and we as listeners would benefit from a real-time, present-day narrative and your own journey and discovery as a way to help us connect with this material from the past. And so they kind of nudged me to put more of myself in it, which, even if I like hamming it up doing my grandparents, was totally uncomfortable. To Marco Di Capua's point, the fact that my grandparents were no longer around was concerning to me. I was lucky that my grandfather had written this autobiography. There was all kinds of tape and material about them. And then we had these boxes, or as my collaborator said, your grandmother was in pre-production for this for 80 years. Like, she, which is just true. Like, she had literally, like, here's the stuff, it was all set up and organized. I even translated, into English so that your non-Italian speaking grandson, could, and so I was fortunate to have all of that material, but didn't have what I was used to, which was being able to go get the principles on tape and work with that. And then I was also kind of worried about doing the voices. Like, I did it at the beginning just as a way to try to help my collaborators get a sense of who these characters were. And then we tried Dustin will remember, many different ways. Like, we had other voice actors do their voices. We had me do my grandfather, which seemed believable, but have a female actor do my grandmother. And ultimately my collaborators were like, no, like, it sounds like a man doing a woman's voice, but we believe it's your connection to your grandparents, which is part of our way in here. And so they kind of persisted in that way. So I think that felt challenging as well. And I was also, I felt concerned about present day politics, not only in our country, but as relates to Israel, Gaza, etc. As like the podcast was coming out during that period, and would it get sort of swept up into talking about that conflict instead of what I wanted to talk about? And I think fortunately it largely hasn't, in that people have connected to the universality of the story. A lot of the comments on the just in the Apple reviews that feel really rewarding are people saying, like, my family's from Syria, my family's from South America, my family, we face these same universal questions of what do families do in moments of crisis when some are going and some are staying, and how do we make these decisions? So that, that felt satisfying too. But I guess I believe in working with focus groups, and we had a lot of people, like just friends and colleagues listen to the early cuts of this. We made 7 cuts basically of each of these episodes. They started out at about an hour and a half a pop and got them down to 30 or 40 minutes. Thank you, you're welcome. Yeah, and the fewer ads about the tea, but that feedback, I think, is also just so important and helpful. And I actually found that the audio industry maybe isn't so geared that way, whereas we documentary filmmakers will just screen stuff again and again and again and again until it feels right. And so I tried to bring that as best I could to audio. And I think that was helpful too, in both improving the product, but making me feel more comfortable that we were doing our best to get it right.
Let's do 2 more, if that's okay. Lady in the front here.
Grazie. My name is Sylvia Pirani. We communicated over email. My father, Corrado Levi Pirani, came to New York in 1939 because his father had been fired from his job as professor of chemistry in Milano. And I don't know very much about his first few years here, and the story was very the podcasts were very thought-provoking for me. I have a question about the apple orchard. There was a moment that I learned that my father was here at age 25 and his cousins were visiting, and the Italian Jewish cousins, and they all went to an apple orchard in north of New York. And I'm wondering, the King of the Books had an apple orchard, right?
Could have been, yeah.
That's an amazing story, that the King of the Books
Yeah, you will. I mean, I think you were asking before about my great-grandfather just as a person, and this was the guy that got them out. I think in many ways the decision that was almost as impressive to me as getting out was the decision, this is a bit of a spoiler, not so much, but in episode 10 of the podcast, which is that after the war, so they came here to New York. My great-grandfather, seeing that there was a lot of anti-Italian animus, was inspired about the idea of maybe they could grow their own food and kind of get off the grid a bit, and had the means to buy this apple orchard in upstate New York and moved his family to LaGrangeville. And the guy that was running this huge media distribution empire became an apple farmer. It turned out his son, my grandmother's brother, was a chemist, and they actually partnered with Cornell using technology that Cornell had pioneered but didn't have capital to really pilot, and they created the first cold storage for apples, and that allowed them to bring their apples to market in the winter when you know, and so he had like pretty good success there as well. But the choice after the war, when he went back to Bologna, went back to look at his kind of ravaged company, which he had created for himself the opportunity that he could have bought back into, and he ultimately kind of saw that, yeah, maybe we can get out of all this debt and we could remount the whole company, but it's kind of going to be a real big headache, and I feel peaceful here, and I'm going to stay. And so I thought I was interested in that choice as well, because I think this question of whether to go, flee, stay, go, was a question I hadn't realized that everyone was asking themselves after the war to the same degree that they were beforehand, and that's a lot in the letters of my grandparents.
Okay, last one.
I bet it was that apple orchard. Maybe we can find out.
Oh, you've put your hand down? Okay. Yes.
I saw something, just a real quick snippet. Did I see an image of a Madonna that looked as though its origins were Sicilian?
In my presentation earlier?
Yes.
If it was, I don't know about it or didn't intend to. Could be. A Madonna?
Grazie.
Okay. We do one more. That was such a short one. Please.
This may be too large a question for the end, but I was taken by one sentence. Someone said, why so late does there seem to be so much consciousness now of histories, of different histories? And I've been thinking of the multiplicity of various societies now, the fact that borders aren't as clear, and it goes into individual identity, each person wanting to go into their past, and also into collective identity. And certainly America, 30, 40 years ago, I don't think there was as much freedom as there is to start speaking about individual groups and individual identity. We're living in such an age of such multiplicity, and maybe that's also why the fear of fascism comes, because suddenly there's a cacophony of voices all demanding identity. And I just wondered if that in any way provokes some of the reasons why we're erupting now with stories and consciousness of history.
Thank you. It must be for you.
It's for you.
No, it's definitely for you.
I would just say that's a great observation, honestly. I think it's a great observation. I don't have much to add. No, really. It's an interesting food for thought.
The only insight I can have for you is that the writers in the 30s, especially someone in Spain like Ortega y Gasset, talks about everyone has an opinion. You talk about everyone having an identity, but at the time, with the newspapers, everyone had an opinion. And suddenly it wasn't just the elites who had an opinion. I think social media gives everyone an opinion and a platform, and everyone's opinion is equal. So that's part of, I think, also the cacophony.
Yeah, and
but
also the conformity of a society, and less conformity, and therefore problems.
Yes. Okay. Well, a fascinating. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Richard.